The sounds were the most terrifying part, the sounds that had no place here in this tomb of knowledge. Not the grand, echoing silence of the university halls at midnight, but the small, secret noises that filled his office. The soft, wet slide of skin against skin, the frantic whisper of a breath caught in a throat, the low, shuddering moan that was swallowed by the heavy wool of his own jacket. His office, a sanctuary of intellect for over 20 years, had become the stage for a sacrament of sin, and the leather of his antique chair creaked a rhythmic, damning protest beneath Clara's weight. Her scent, a dizzying mix of jasmine and youth, mingled with the familiar, comforting smell of old paper and leather-bound books, creating a perfume of pure transgression. Her fingers dug into the tweed of his shoulders, her body arching against his in a desperate, silent plea. This was not the gentle exploration of their first encounters. This was a frantic, almost violent claiming, fueled by the sheer, exhilarating terror of their location. The portraits of long-dead poets on his walls seemed to watch with hollow eyes as he, Dr. Alistair Finch, a man built of footnotes and measured phrases, lost himself in a language older than any words he had ever taught. But this fever, this desperate climax on the edge of ruin, was not the beginning. The beginning was far quieter, far more insidious, rooted not in the weakness of the flesh, but in the hunger of the mind. Months earlier, Alistair's life was a fortress of routine, each day a perfect replica of the last. He was a respected figure, a man whose opinions on Keats and Shelley were considered definitive. His marriage to Eleanor was a polite, well-managed partnership of shared calendars and silent breakfasts, a comfortable arrangement that had long ago shed the untidy burden of passion. His world was serene, predictable, and suffocatingly gray. And then, Clara Rhodes walked into his graduate seminar. She wasn't just beautiful in the way that youth is effortlessly beautiful, with her cascade of dark hair and eyes that held an unforgiving intelligence. It was her mind, a mind like a flash of lightning in his dusty academic sky. She challenged his interpretations. She saw nuances he had overlooked for years. She spoke of poetry with a raw, breathless passion that he dimly remembered feeling himself, once, a lifetime ago. He found himself waiting for her comments, for the way she would bite her lower lip before dismantling a century-old theory with a simple, devastating question. He told himself it was purely intellectual admiration, the delight of a master finding a worthy apprentice. It was a clean, noble lie, the first of many he would learn to tell himself. The seminar room was Alistair's kingdom, a controlled environment of aged mahogany, filtered sunlight, and the faint, sweet scent of decaying paper. For years, he had orchestrated the intellectual waltz within these walls with an easy, practiced authority. The students, bright as they were a predictable chorus, their thoughts and arguments falling into familiar patterns. He could anticipate their epiphanies, preempt their questions, and gently guide them toward conclusions he had reached decades ago. It was a comfortable, if sterile, dominion. Clara Rhodes shattered that peace from the very first session. She did not participate in the waltz. She seized the floor and began a tango, fiery and unpredictable. That day, they were dissecting Blake's dialectic of innocence and experience, a topic Alistair could lecture on in his sleep. He had just finished a polished monologue on the inherent pity and suppressed rage within the songs of experience when her voice, clear and steady, cut through the deferential silence. She wasn't challenging him, not directly. It was more subtle, more dangerous. She was questioning the very foundation of his interpretation. She argued that experience was not a fall from grace, but a necessary, even beautiful act of creation, the forging of a soul through fire. She spoke of the tiger not as a symbol of terror, but of a sublime, untamable truth, a kind of terrible divinity that the Lamb of Innocence could never comprehend. The other students watched, their pens hovering over their notebooks, sensing a shift in the room's gravity. Alistair felt it too, a prickling on his skin, an unwelcome acceleration of his heart. He found his gaze fixed on her, truly on her, for the first time. He had noted her name on the roster, registered a pretty face, but now he saw the force behind it. Her eyes, a deep, thoughtful hazel, were not looking at him for approval, but for engagement. They were the eyes of an equal, and the sheer audacity of it was both insulting and intoxicating. He saw the way she pushed a strand of dark brown hair from her brow, the gesture unconsciously elegant, her hand slender and pale against the rich color of her hair. He noticed, with an absurd clarity, the way her simple white blouse gapped slightly at the collar when she leaned forward, offering a fleeting, chaste glimpse of her collarbone. He countered her argument, pulling on the weight of established scholarship, his tone calm and professorial. But she met him at every turn, her own arguments built not on dusty citations, but on a raw, intuitive connection to the poetry. She spoke of the rhythm, the feeling, the ache in the words, while he spoke of their structure and history. It was a duel between analysis and emotion, and for the first time in a long time, Alistair felt unsure of his ground. When the class ended, the usual low chatter of students gathering their things was replaced by a charged silence. He felt drained, but also strangely, exhilaratingly alive. Their intellectual sparring sessions soon spilled into his office hours. His office, once a quiet refuge for thought, became the designated arena for their duels. She would arrive, always punctual, with a book full of notes and a fresh challenge. She'd sit in the worn leather chair opposite his desk, the one usually reserved for nervous undergraduates, and she would fill the space with her vibrant energy. He became a connoisseur of her small mannerisms. The way she would bite her lower lip, leaving the faintest indentation, as she formulated a thought that would dismantle his previous point. The way her hands, which he now saw were remarkably expressive, would dance in the air, shaping her ideas as if they were tangible objects. He found himself looking forward to these sessions with an eagerness that unsettled him. The conversations were always, on the surface, about literature. They moved from Blake to the Brontes, from Don's metaphysical conceits to Woolf's streams of consciousness. But beneath the academic discourse, another conversation was taking place. When she asked him why Heathcliff's love was so destructive, he felt she was really asking about the nature of his own passions, buried deep beneath a placid surface. When she spoke of Mrs. Dalloway's internal world, he felt she could see directly into his own silent, lonely chambers. One rainy Tuesday, she stayed late, the sky outside turning a bruised purple. The official purpose of the meeting, a question about her term paper, had been exhausted an hour ago. Now they were just talking. He made coffee on the small machine in the corner of his office, the domesticity of the act feeling strangely intimate. He handed her a mug, his fingers brushing against hers for a fraction of a second. The contact was electric, a jolt of pure, unadulterated awareness that made him pull his hand back as if burned. She didn't seem to notice, or if she did, she gave no sign. She simply cradled the warm mug in her hands, her gaze soft in the lamplight. "You know, Professor," she said, her voice lower than usual, "I sometimes think the most tragic figures in literature aren't the ones who suffer great calamities. They're the ones who build perfect, orderly lives and then realize they've never truly lived at all." She was looking at a framed print of a stoic-looking Tennyson on his wall, but Alistair felt her words land directly on him, a perfectly aimed arrow. He felt exposed, seen in a way he hadn't been in years, perhaps ever. His wife, Eleanor, saw him as a provider, a stable fixture in her well-ordered social life. His colleagues saw him as a respected academic. His students saw him as an authority figure. But Clara, in that moment, seemed to see the ghost of the young man he had once been, the one who chose literature because it felt more real than life, only to end up using it as a shield against living. That night, he went home to a house that was impeccably clean and profoundly empty. Eleanor was on the phone in the living room, her voice a crisp, efficient murmur as she finalized arrangements for a charity auction. She smiled at him, a brief, dutiful acknowledgement of his presence, before turning her attention back to the call. The scent of lemon polish hung in the air, a sterile counterpoint to the ghost scent of jasmine and coffee that seemed to cling to his clothes. He went to his study, the home version of his office, filled with the same books, the same quiet dignity, but the room felt different. It felt like a museum exhibit of his life, not the life itself. He picked up his copy of Blake, its pages soft and worn. He opened it, but the words blurred. He wasn't reading. He was hearing Clara's voice, seeing her lean forward in the lamplight, feeling the phantom touch of her fingers. A feeling was stirring in his chest, a low, dangerous hum of possibility. It was the thrill of being truly seen, of being challenged, of being wanted not for his function or his reputation, but for the contents of his mind, and he was beginning to suspect his soul. He stood at the window, looking out at the manicured lawn, and understood with a terrifying certainty that the intellectual spark had already been struck. All it needed now was a breath, a touch, a moment of weakness to erupt into an uncontrollable flame. The opportunity presented itself wrapped in the guise of academic obligation. It was a small regional symposium held at a neighboring college, a dreary affair of lukewarm coffee and self-important panel discussions. Alistair was the keynote speaker, a minor honor that felt more like a chore. He delivered his address on the erosion of meaning in postmodern poetry to polite applause, his own words sounding hollow and rehearsed in his ears. But as he spoke, his eyes kept finding her in the third row. Clara. She hadn't said a word to him all day, yet her presence was a magnetic force, pulling his attention from his own carefully prepared sentences. She wasn't looking at him with the fawning admiration of a student. She was watching him with that same intense, analytical gaze from the seminar room, as if she were deconstructing not his speech, but the man delivering it. When the event finally petered out into a dreary reception with bad wine and cubes of cheese, he saw his chance. While his colleagues clustered together, reinforcing their own importance, he saw her standing alone by a large window, looking out at the darkening campus. He walked over, his heart a nervous drum against his ribs. "I didn't expect to see you here," he said, his voice sounding unnaturally loud to his own ears. She turned, a faint, knowing smile on her lips. "I wouldn't miss it. Your speech was brilliant, Professor. Incisive." There was a pause, and then she added, "But you look tired of hearing your own words." The comment was so direct, so perceptive, it left him without a defense. "Perhaps I am," he admitted, the honesty feeling like a small liberation. The air between them thickened, charged with everything left unsaid over the past few months. The formal reception was out of the question. Being seen with her there, talking with such intimacy, would be a breach of an unwritten code. "I'm driving back towards town now," he said, the lie forming easily. "It's on my way. I can give you a ride if you like. Save you the trouble of the campus shuttle." It was a flimsy pretext. They both knew her apartment was in the opposite direction, but she simply nodded, her eyes holding his. "I'd like that very much, Alistair." The sound of his first name, spoken by her for the first time, without the title of Professor, was a quiet detonation. It was the closing of one door and the opening of another. The car was a cocoon, insulating them from the world. The darkness outside rushed past, streetlights smearing across the windows. Rain began to fall, first as a gentle patter, then as a steady, hypnotic drumming on the roof. The scent of her perfume, that intoxicating jasmine, was a tangible presence in the enclosed space. For a few miles, they drove in a comfortable silence, the kind that exists only between two people who have already said 1,000 things without speaking. He was acutely aware of her sitting beside him, the faint warmth emanating from her, the soft sound of her breathing. Finally, she spoke again, her voice low. "You know," she said, looking straight ahead at the slick black road, "when you were up there on the stage, you seemed lonely, like a king in an empty castle." He didn't deny it. He couldn't. Castles can become prisons, Clara. The admission hung in the air, a confession of a lifetime of quiet desperation. He turned off the main road, following a sign for a scenic overlook he knew would be deserted on a night like this. He pulled the car to a stop, killing the engine. Now, the only sounds were the rain and the frantic beat of his own heart. The world outside was a watery blur. Inside, everything was sharp, terrifyingly clear. He turned to look at her in the dim glow of the dashboard lights. She was already looking at him, her expression unreadable but intense. This was it, the precipice he had been walking towards for months. He could still turn back, start the engine, make a joke about the weather, and drive her home. He could retreat to his safe gray life. And this night would become another secret, another what if to be buried. But he saw the truth in her eyes, a reflection of the same desperate hunger he felt in his own soul. He didn't know who moved first. Perhaps he leaned in, perhaps she met him halfway. It didn't matter. The collision was inevitable, a matter of physics and fate. The first touch of their lips was not gentle. It was a shock, a desperate, almost violent pressing of mouths, a raw confirmation of a mutual need that had grown too large to be contained by words or intellect. It was a kiss of profound recognition, a drowning man finding air. All the suppressed desire, all the stolen glances, all the intellectual foreplay culminated in this one searing, irrefutable act. When they finally pulled apart, they were both breathless, their foreheads resting against each other. "Alistair," she whispered, her voice husky. It was not a question, but a statement, an acceptance. He looked into her eyes and saw no fear, no regret. He saw only a fierce, unwavering certainty that mirrored the sudden, terrifying calm that had settled over him. In that moment, he knew he was lost, and for the first time, he felt completely found. His hand, shaking slightly, came up to cup her face, his thumb stroking the soft skin of her cheek. His fingers, so accustomed to the dry, brittle feel of ancient paper, reveled in the living warmth of her. He traced the line of her jaw, tangled his hand in her damp hair, pulling her gently back to him for another kiss. This one, slower, deeper, a kiss of exploration. His other hand moved from the steering wheel to her coat, his fingers fumbling with the buttons. He was clumsy, an adolescent again in his eagerness. He slid the heavy wool from her shoulders. Beneath it, she wore the same simple, scholarly white blouse from his memories of the seminar room. But as his trembling fingers worked their way down the row of small pearl buttons, he felt the delicate, textured fabric of lace beneath. He pushed the cotton aside, and his breath caught in his throat. In the faint, green light of the dashboard, he saw it. A bra of intricate black lace, a stark, deliberate contrast to her intellectual exterior. It was a piece of secret armor, a hidden declaration of a sensuality he had only dreamed of. It was the most erotic thing he had ever seen. This was the final piece of the puzzle, the confirmation that the brilliant mind was housed in an equally aware, equally passionate body. With a reverence that surprised him, he traced the edge of the lace with one finger, his touch feather-light. He felt her shiver beneath his hand. He looked up at her face, seeking permission, and she gave it with a slight, almost imperceptible nod. His hand moved from the lace to the skin above it, and then, finally, he cupped the soft, full weight of her breast in his palm. The sensation was overwhelming. The shocking softness, the warmth of her skin through the thin fabric, the hardened peak of her nipple pressing into his hand. A low sound, a half-groan, half-sob, escaped his lips. The line had not just been crossed, it had been obliterated. The rain hammered down on the roof of the car, a wild, percussive symphony for his spectacular fall from grace. And he knew, with a certainty that was both horrifying and glorious, that nothing in his life would ever be the same again. The drive home was a journey through a dreamscape. The familiar suburban streets of his quiet town seemed alien, the houses with their warm, welcoming lights like dioramas of a life that no longer belonged to him. The car, his own familiar Volvo, felt like a borrowed vessel, a crime scene that still held the ghost of its transgression. Her scent, a stubborn, sweet mix of jasmine and rain-soaked wool, lingered in the air, a phantom passenger in the seat beside him. The passenger side window was still fogged from her breath. He reached out a trembling hand and wiped a small circle clean, the glass cold against his fingertips. It was a futile gesture. He could never wipe away the imprint she had left on this space, on him. His mind, trained for decades to deconstruct poetry, to dissect meter and metaphor, began to work on the events of the last hour with a frantic, obsessive precision. He was performing a literary analysis on his own ruin. The text for his analysis was the memory of her body, a memory so vivid it was a physical ache. He began with the kiss. It was not, his mind noted, a gentle unfolding, but a sudden, violent stanza break in the poem of his life. He could still feel the surprising softness of her lips, a yielding texture that belied the fierce hunger behind them. There was a taste to her, a taste of coffee and mint and something else, something uniquely her, a flavor of pure vitality. It was the taste of a life lived without the constant, suffocating filter of propriety. He had spent his career analyzing the sublime, and in that one desperate kiss, he had finally experienced it. Then came the memory of the fabric, a study in contrasts that his literary soul couldn't help but admire. The plain, almost severe cotton of her blouse, a uniform of scholarly intent, and beneath it, the secret text, the intricate, whispered promise of black lace. He obsessed over that detail. It was a deliberate choice, a hidden layer of meaning. It told him that her passion was not an accident. It was a fundamental part of her, a truth she wore close to her skin, waiting for the right reader to discover it. The memory of his clumsy fingers fumbling with the buttons, of the pristine white fabric parting to reveal the dark, complex pattern beneath, was an image of revelation, the unmasking of a goddess. And then, the core of the experience, the moment that had rewired his entire sensory world, the feel of her breast in his palm. His mind, the ever-present critic, searched for an adequate metaphor. It was heavier than he expected, fuller, with a living warmth that seemed to pulse against his hand. He thought of classical statues, of the idealized forms of women carved in cold, dead marble, and he dismissed the comparison instantly. This was not the inert perfection of art. This was the flawed, breathing, undeniable perfection of reality. The skin was impossibly soft, and when his thumb brushed over her nipple, he felt it harden, a definitive, declarative statement that sent a shockwave straight to his core. It was an answer to a question he hadn't even known he was asking. It was a response, a confirmation, a mutual acknowledgement of the primal current flowing between them. Even in the frantic, cramped confines of the car, he had felt the architecture of her body. As he pulled her towards him, he felt the elegant, strong curve of her back, the line of her spine, a taut wire of energy. He remembered the solid, womanly curve of her hip pressing against his thigh, a promise of a deeper, more complete union that the front seat of a Volvo could never allow. It was this promise, this glimpse into a world of unbridled physical truth that was now lodged in his mind like a hook. He finally pulled into his own driveway. The automatic garage light flickered on, illuminating his perfectly manicured lawn and the neat, symmetrical facade of his house. It was a picture of success, of stability, of everything he was supposed to be. It looked like a lie. He walked into the silent house. The air was still and smelled faintly of the lavender potpourri Eleanor insisted on. A single lamp was on in the living room, casting long, lonely shadows. He caught his reflection in the large, gilt-framed mirror in the hallway, and for a moment, he didn't recognize the man staring back at him. It was Professor Finch, yes, the same tweed jacket, the same tired eyes. But there was something else there now, a wildness in the set of his jaw, a flush of color high on his cheeks. His hair was disheveled, not from thought, but from a woman's fingers. He looked like a man who had just crawled from a wreckage. He was a whited sepulcher, a beautiful tomb, and he had just been pried open. He climbed the stairs to their bedroom. Eleanor was asleep, a still form under the perfectly smooth duvet. Her breathing was a soft, even rhythm, the sound of a life undisturbed. On her nightstand was a glass of water and a book with a silk bookmark. The room was a sanctuary of peace, of order, of a passionless, comfortable twilight. And he, with the scent of another woman on his skin and the taste of a forbidden kiss still on his lips, was a profanity within it. He undressed in the dark, his clothes feeling alien on his body. He slipped into the bed, the clean, cool sheets a shock against his fevered skin. He lay on his back, staring into the darkness, his body rigid, separated from his sleeping wife by a chasm far wider than the few feet of mattress between them. He felt more alone in that moment, lying in his own bed, than he had ever felt in his life. He closed his eyes, but there was no rest. There was only the image, burned onto the backs of his eyelids, a pale shoulder, a cascade of dark hair, and the intricate, beautiful, damning pattern of black lace. Desire, he now understood, was not an abstract concept to be debated in a seminar room. It was an anatomy. It had a weight, a texture, a scent, a taste. It was the curve of a hip, the weight of a breast, the desperate, shuddering intake of a breath. And now that he had studied its form, he knew with a terrifying and exhilarating certainty that he would have to learn its language completely. The week that followed their frantic encounter in the car was a study in exquisite torture. Every waking moment was saturated with the memory of her, a constant, low-grade fever in his blood. The world had split into two distinct realities: the dull, gray one he inhabited with Eleanor and his colleagues, and the vibrant, secret world that existed solely in his mind, a world that smelled of jasmine and rain. He knew with a certainty that frightened him that the furtive, unfinished business in his car was not an ending, but a prelude. The intellectual affair had been the kindling, the kiss had been the spark, but the fire itself had not yet truly been lit. This time, there would be no pretense of accident, no comfort of spontaneity. This would be a deliberate, premeditated act of sin. The planning was done through a series of terse, coded emails, their subject lines pertaining to an upcoming rare book fair in a town an hour away. It was a perfect excuse, a plausible academic alibi that gave them a 12-hour window of freedom. "I've booked a room to rest between sessions," he wrote, his fingers trembling slightly over the keyboard. "Room 207, the Elm Street Inn. I hope to see you there." Her reply came within minutes, a single, unambiguous word: anticipating. That word became his mantra, his torment, his promise. He drove to the Elm Street Inn with the windows down, despite the autumn chill, needing the cold air to clear his head. It was useless. His mind was a maelstrom of guilt, fear, and a roaring, triumphant lust that drowned out everything else. The guilt was a distant, nagging hum. The anticipation was a deafening symphony. He checked into the room, a clean, anonymous space with a king-sized bed that dominated the room like an altar. The art on the wall was a generic print of a sailboat. The room had no history, no personality. It was a blank slate, a perfect, sterile vessel for the messy, beautiful thing they were about to do. He waited for what felt like an eternity, pacing the floor, checking his reflection, straightening the collar of his shirt. And then he heard it. A soft, hesitant knock on the door. He took a deep breath, his heart hammering, and opened it. She stood there, looking impossibly lovely. She wore a simple blue dress and the same coat from that rainy night, but there was a new confidence in her eyes, a womanly self-possession that had replaced the student's deference. She stepped inside, and he closed the door behind her, the soft click of the lock sealing them off from the rest of the world. For a moment, they just stood there, the reality of the room, of their shared intention, hanging heavy in the air. Then she smiled, a slow, intoxicating smile, and broke the silence. "Hello, Professor," she said, her voice a low, teasing whisper. He closed the distance between them and kissed her, and this time there was no fumbling, no frantic desperation. It was a deep, knowing kiss, a slow, deliberate claiming. He tasted her anticipation, and she tasted his. He slowly unbuttoned her coat, letting it fall to the floor. Then, his hands went to the zipper on her blue dress. He slid it down, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet room, and let the fabric pool around her feet. She stood before him in nothing but the same black lace he had been dreaming of, a matching set this time, a deliberate, breathtaking presentation. "My turn," she whispered, and her fingers, no longer hesitant, went to the buttons of his shirt. He stood passive as she undressed him, her touch a delicious torment, her eyes never leaving his. It was a slow, mutual unveiling, an act of ultimate vulnerability. When they were both finally naked in the dim afternoon light filtering through the curtains, he felt stripped not just of his clothes, but of his identity, of his age, of his entire carefully constructed life. He was no longer Professor Finch. He was just Alistair, a man, her man. He led her to the bed, and for a long time, they just explored each other with their hands and mouths, learning the landscape of each other's bodies with a reverence and a desperate curiosity. He discovered the sensitive hollow at the base of her throat, The way a trail of kisses down her spine made her arch her back and moan his name. She in turn discovered the way he shivered when she traced the line of his hip, the guttural groan he couldn't suppress when her lips brushed the inside of his thigh. When he could wait no longer, he positioned himself above her. He looked down into her flushed, beautiful face, her hazel eyes dark with desire. "Clara," he breathed, a prayer. He entered her slowly, and the sensation was so overwhelming he had to close his eyes. She was so warm, so tight, so incredibly wet. The proof of her desire, the slick heat of her, enveloped him, welcomed him home. He began to move, a slow, deep rhythm, and their eyes locked. In that moment, there was no past, no future, no Eleanor, no university. There was only this room, this bed, and the profound, electrifying connection between them. Her soft whimpers began to build into low, throaty moans, sounds of pure, uninhibited pleasure that were the most intoxicating music he had ever heard. She reached up and pulled him down for a ferocious kiss, then whispered in his ear, "Let me." With a lithe, powerful movement, she rolled them over, straddling him. The shift in power was exhilarating. He was now at her mercy, looking up at her magnificent form. Her full breasts, tipped with dark, hardened nipples, swayed with her rhythm. Her head was thrown back, her dark hair a wild halo around her face, a guttural, beautiful cry escaping her lips as her own climax seized her. The sight of her pleasure, so raw and so real, was his undoing. He felt his own release building, a tidal wave of sensation, but he held back, wanting more, wanting all of it. He guided her off him, turning her onto her stomach, and entered her from behind. This was different, more primal, more anonymous. It wasn't about the connection of their gazes, but the pure, unadulterated friction of their bodies. The sound in the room became a symphony of carnality, the rhythmic wet slap of their flesh, their ragged, gasping breaths, her unrestrained cries of pleasure as he drove into her again and again. He reached around, his hand finding her, his thumb moving in sync with his thrusts, until she was screaming into the pillows, her body convulsing around him. That was it. That final, total surrender was what pushed him over the edge. With a final, deep thrust and a hoarse cry, he poured himself into her, a cataclysmic, soul-shattering release that left him utterly spent, his body collapsing onto hers. They lay tangled in the sweat-dampened sheets for a long time, the only sound the thundering of their own hearts slowly returning to a normal rhythm. He was exhausted, drained, but he had never felt more alive. He gently rolled off her, pulling her into the curve of his body. She felt small and fragile in his arms, though he knew she was anything but. He looked at her, at the curve of her spine, the soft swell of her hip, the pulse beating steadily in her neck. The first time, in the car, had been a fall. It was an anomaly, a mistake he could have, in theory, rationalized away. But this was different. This was a choice. This was a meticulously planned descent. Lying here, in this anonymous room, holding this incredible woman in his arms, Alistair Finch knew that he was no longer a good man who had made a mistake. He was simply her man. He had not just stepped into the abyss, he had looked into its depths, saw her waiting for him, and had willingly, joyfully jumped. The raw, explosive encounters gave way to something more complex, more sustainable, and infinitely more dangerous. A routine. Their affair settled into a rhythm, a secret pulse beating beneath the placid surface of Alistair's life. It was a life of compartments, of carefully managed deceptions, and at its heart was the secret language they developed, a code born of their shared academic world. It was a language of exhilarating intimacy, spoken in whispers and shadows. An email with the subject line, "Further thoughts on the metaphysical poets," was a simple check-in, a way to say, "I'm thinking of you." A query about the structural integrity of Faulkner's narrative in The Sound and the Fury was a sign of distress, a need to talk, and the invitations, the true calls to action, were masterpieces of academic subterfuge. "Clara," one might read, "regarding your paper on the Romantics, I urge you to reconsider the primary source material. See Wordsworth, lyrical ballads, Page 207, line 5. Your argument needs a firmer foundation. A. And she would know. The Elm Street Inn, room 207, 5 p.m. It was a thrilling, brilliant game, a way of hiding their carnality in plain sight, cloaking their base desires in the noble vestments of literature. The risk was a constant, addictive spice. Every clandestine meeting was a roll of the dice, every coded message a step further into a world from which there was no return. Their physical encounters evolved beyond the desperate hunger of the first few times. The anonymous hotel room remained their primary sanctuary, but they began to steal moments elsewhere, slivers of time carved out of their public lives. A shared coffee in a bustling cafe 2 towns over, where they could sit across from each other and speak in low tones, their knees occasionally brushing under the table, a jolt of electricity in a sea of strangers, a walk through a park on a crisp autumn afternoon, where he could, for a precious few seconds, take her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers inside his coat pocket, a hidden, shared warmth against the cold. The most dangerous, and therefore the most thrilling, of these stolen moments occurred in the university library. The library was Alistair's natural habitat, a place of profound silence and order. To transgress there was the ultimate sacrilege. He would be in the stacks, ostensibly searching for a forgotten volume, the air thick with the scent of old paper and dust. He would sense her before he saw her, a shift in the atmosphere, a subtle change in the light. Then she would appear at the far end of the narrow aisle, browse a nearby shelf. They would stand there, separated by 20 feet of silence, watching books, their hearts pounding in a shared, frantic rhythm. The presence of other students and faculty members milling about in nearby aisles made the situation exquisitely tense. They couldn't speak, they could barely look at each other. But a silent conversation would pass between them, a look that said everything. On one occasion, he purposefully dropped a book. It landed with a dull thud that sounded like a gunshot in the sacred quiet. A nearby undergraduate looked up from his work with an annoyed frown. Clara walked calmly down the aisle, knelt to pick up the book, and handed it to him. As their fingers met, her nail lightly scraped his palm, a fleeting electric touch that sent a shiver through his entire body. It was over in a second, a moment invisible to the outside world, but for Alistair, it was as intimate as a kiss, a secret signature left on his skin. He felt the thrill of it for hours, a private, burning coal of memory. This was the nature of his addiction. It wasn't just the sex, magnificent as it was the secrecy itself. It was the shared conspiracy, the constant adrenaline, the feeling of living on a knife's edge. He was breaking every rule he had ever lived by, and he had never felt so intensely, horribly alive. This new, vibrant, secret life inevitably began to poison his old one. He started to look at his wife, Eleanor, through a new, critical lens. She was no longer just his partner of 2 decades. She was the warden of his former life, the embodiment of the quiet, passionless world he was now so desperate to escape. The full, bitter extent of this shift became clear during one of Eleanor's meticulously planned dinner parties. Their home was filled with Alistair's colleagues and their spouses, the air thick with polite laughter and the clinking of wine glasses. Eleanor was radiant, a perfect hostess moving through the room with effortless grace, ensuring everyone was comfortable, steering conversations away from anything too controversial or interesting. Alistair watched her and felt nothing but a profound and chilling alienation. He listened to the conversation around him, discussions of tenure-track politics, departmental budgets, the tedious minutiae of academic life, and the even more tedious bragging about children's accomplishments. It all sounded like meaningless noise, the chatter of ghosts. He felt like an anthropologist, observing the rituals of a strange, lifeless tribe. He sat at the head of his own table, a king in an empty castle, just as Clara had described him. He smiled, he nodded, he played his part, but inside he was screaming. And then he felt the subtle vibration in his pocket. He knew, without looking, that it was her. Under the cover of the tablecloth, he slid his phone out. The screen lit up with a message from Clara. The text simply read, "Thinking of Blake's tiger, burning bright." It was their code. It meant, "I want you. I'm thinking of you tearing me apart. A jolt of pure, unadulterated lust shot through him, so powerful it made him dizzy. He sat there, next to his wife, surrounded by his peers, and he was having a more intimate, more honest conversation with a woman miles away than with anyone in the room. He could almost feel her, smell her, taste her. The rich flavor of the Boeuf Bourguignon Eleanor had spent all day preparing turned to ash in his mouth. He looked at his wife as she laughed at a joke told by the dean. He saw the carefully maintained hair, the expensive but conservative dress, the polite, passionless smile, and he felt a wave of something cold and cruel. He didn't love her. He wasn't sure he ever had. She was a co-architect of the beautiful, hollow life he had built, and he was beginning to hate her for it. He excused himself, claiming a headache, and went to his study. He locked the door and leaned against it, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He typed a reply to Clara, his fingers slick with sweat. Fearful symmetry. It was the next line of the poem. It meant, "I want you too. The thought of you terrifies and excites me." He sent the message and felt a wave of relief so intense it was almost painful. He had become a masterful liar, an expert in the art of the double life. He had his rules, his codes, his secret schedules. He felt in those moments completely in control. But as he stood alone in the silence of his study, listening to the muffled sounds of the party continuing without him, a sliver of cold truth pierced through his adrenaline-fueled haze. This control was an illusion. He was an addict, and the addiction was running his life. The secret language he had created with Clara was becoming the only one he was fluent in, the only one that felt real. The polite public language of his marriage and his career felt foreign, a dialect he could barely remember how to speak. The silence in his own home was no longer peaceful. It was deafening. The addiction demanded a stronger dose, a greater risk. The carefully planned sanctuary of the anonymous hotel room began to feel too safe. The stolen moments in cafes too tame. The thrill, that intoxicating chemical wash of adrenaline and lust, required a more dangerous setting to achieve its full potency. The idea took root in Alistair's mind and festered there, a dark and brilliant flower of temptation. His office, the very heart of his kingdom, the seat of his power and his intellect, the room that contained the entire architecture of his public self. To have her there, to take her amidst the symbols of his life's work, was a transgression so profound, so audacious, that the thought alone made his breath catch in his throat. It was no longer about finding a place to hide their affair. It was about forcing his secret life to triumph over his public one, to plant its flag on conquered ground. He didn't plan it with a coded email. It was an impulse, born of a long, torturous week of near misses and burning frustration. It was a Friday evening, the university slowly bleeding out its students and faculty, the hallways growing long and quiet. She came to his office, as she often did, with the pretext of a question about her thesis bibliography. She closed the door behind her, and the usual academic pretense lasted no more than 30 seconds. The air was thick with a palpable, humming energy. He could see the same reckless desire in her eyes that he felt clawing at his own insides. They stood on opposite sides of his large oak desk, the very desk where he graded papers, wrote lectures, and met with the dean. It was a solid, respectable piece of furniture, a monument to a lifetime of intellectual labor. Tonight, it would become an altar. Without a word, he walked around it, took her face in his hands, and kissed her with a desperate, almost brutal intensity. It was not a kiss of tenderness. It was a kiss of conspiracy and intent. She moaned softly into his mouth, a sound of immediate and total surrender. He pulled away, his breath ragged, and walked back to the door. He turned the heavy brass lock. The solid, final click echoed in the silent room. It was the sound of a decision made, a final line crossed from which there would be no retreat. He turned back to her, his eyes dark, with a hunger that shocked even himself. "Here," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "I want you. Here. Now." A flicker of fear, or perhaps exhilaration, crossed her face. She looked around at the walls, at the framed degrees from Oxford and Yale, at the shelves groaning with the weight of centuries of literature, at the portrait of a stern-looking Chaucer. This was his sanctuary, and he was inviting her to help him desecrate it. She gave a slow, deliberate nod, a silent acceptance of his madness. He went to his desk, and with a sweep of his arm, he cleared a space, sending a cascade of student essays, journals, and pens fluttering to the floor. The sound of the papers hitting the Persian rug was like the rustling of dead leaves. He lifted her effortlessly, placing her on the cool, polished edge of the wood. She gasped as her bare legs made contact with the cold surface. He knelt before her, an act of pure worship. He was the esteemed professor, the man of authority, and he was on his knees before his student, his lover, his beautiful, brilliant weakness. He pushed the fabric of her skirt up around her waist and hooked his thumbs into the waistband of her panties, sliding them down her legs. He tossed the small piece of silk aside, and it landed on a first edition of Paradise Lost. The irony was not lost on him. He leaned in, his face buried in the warmth between her thighs, his senses overwhelmed by her scent, the clean, feminine smell of her arousal. He worshipped her with his mouth, his tongue learning her, tasting her, bringing her to a shuddering, breathless climax that she had to stifle by biting down hard on her own hand, her knuckles white. Her muffled cry was a sound of such exquisite, private pleasure that it drove him to the edge of his own control. He rose, his body trembling with the effort of holding back. He shed his jacket, tore at his tie, and unbuckled his belt with frantic, clumsy fingers. He pushed himself against her, his desire made flesh, his hardness pressing against her soft, wet core. She wrapped her legs around his waist, pulling him in, taking all of him with a greedy sigh. He braced his hands on the desk on either side of her and began to move, a powerful, driving rhythm that made the heavy oak desk groan in protest. His reflection, and hers, was a distorted, writhing image in the dark glass of the window behind them. They were a single, two-backed beast, a creature of pure id, performing a profane ritual in the temple of the superego. Each thrust was a rebellion. Each moan, swallowed by his shoulder, was a victory against the silence and repression of his life. He felt the solid weight of his own published books pressing against his back as he moved, the words he had so carefully crafted, now just dumb witnesses to this raw, elemental act. The world narrowed to the feel of her body enveloping his, the sound of their skin slapping together, the sight of her face, eyes closed, lost in a world of pure sensation. The climax, when it came, was a silent, violent explosion, a shared paroxysm of pleasure so intense it bordered on pain. They clung to each other, shaking, their bodies slick with sweat as the aftershocks subsided. The silence that followed was different. It was not peaceful, it was heavy, accusatory. The spell was broken. The room, which moments before had been their savage playground, was now just a mess. His office. Papers were scattered across the floor like casualties of a battle. A faint, animal scent of sex hung in the air, a stark contrast to the usual smell of books and floor polish. He looked at Clara, her face flushed, her hair a mess, her skirt still pushed up around her waist. She looked like a beautiful shipwreck. The recklessness of what they had just done crashed down on him with the force of a physical blow. A janitor, a security guard, a colleague working late, any one of them could have walked by, heard them, tried the locked door. The sheer, colossal stupidity of the risk was staggering. "You should go," he said, his voice flat. There was no tenderness in it, only a sudden, cold panic. She slid off the desk, her movements quiet and graceful, and quickly, silently, put herself back in order. She transformed back into Clara Rhodes, the graduate student. He, in turn, tucked in his shirt, straightened his trousers, his movements stiff and robotic. She walked to the door and paused, her hand on the knob. She looked back at him, and in her eyes, he saw not regret, but a flicker of triumph. "Goodbye, Alistair," she said softly, and then she was gone, a ghost disappearing back into the quiet, empty hallway. He was left alone in the wreckage of his sanctuary. He mechanically began to pick up the scattered papers, his hands shaking. He tried to restore order, to put things back as they were, but it was a fool's errand. The room was forever tainted. The air, the desk, the very books on the shelves felt different, as if they knew his secret. He slumped into his chair, the leather still holding the faint warmth of their bodies. He had done it. He had taken the greatest possible risk and had, for a moment, felt like a god. But now, in the aftermath, the thrill had curdled into a cold, heavy dread. He had proven to himself that there was no line he wouldn't cross for her, no part of his life he wouldn't defile. He had reached the summit of his recklessness, and as he stared at his own haunted face in the dark reflection of the window, he knew with absolute certainty that the only thing left was the fall. The euphoric, godlike recklessness of that night in his office evaporated with the morning light, leaving behind a cold, sticky residue of fear. The act, which had felt like a triumphant conquest in the heat of the moment, now replayed in his mind as a piece of colossal, unforgivable stupidity. Every creak of the floorboards in the hallway outside his office made him jump. Every unexpected knock on his door sent a jolt of pure ice through his veins. He started seeing accusation in the neutral glances of his colleagues, suspicion in the friendly greetings of the janitorial staff. The world, which had recently seemed so full of vibrant, secret life, now felt like a panopticon, with 1,000 unseen eyes watching his every move, waiting for him to slip. The thrill had been a fever, and now, in its wake, came the chills, a deep, gnawing anxiety that settled in his bones. The affair was no longer a secret garden he could escape to. It was a landmine he had planted in the center of his own life, and he was forced to walk around it every single day, praying he remembered its exact location. The nature of his communication with Clara began to shift as well, a subtle but significant change that added a new layer of complication to his fear. The coded messages, once a thrilling game of literary seduction, took on a new weight, a new emotional neediness. The desire was still there, a constant, burning undercurrent, but it was now tangled with something else. One evening, a message arrived. Reading Jane Eyre, thinking about Mr. Rochester and the madwoman hidden in the attic. Alistair felt a cold knot form in his stomach. The implication was clear. He was Rochester, and Eleanor, his placid, oblivious wife, was the madwoman in the attic, the inconvenient, passionless obstacle to their great romance. It was a romantic, tragic framing of their sordid affair, and while part of him was flattered by the comparison to the brooding literary hero, another, more rational part was terrified. This wasn't the language of a simple fling, this was the language of epic love, of soulmates kept apart by cruel fate. It was a narrative she was building for them, a narrative that demanded a dramatic, life-altering conclusion he was in no way prepared to provide. The requests to meet became more frequent, tinged with a new urgency. The simple, lustful anticipation was being replaced by a possessiveness that felt like another closing wall. The full weight of this emotional fallout crashed down on him during a quiet Tuesday dinner with Eleanor. It was an evening like 1,000 others before it. Eleanor had made salmon with dill sauce, his favorite. The candles were lit. A bottle of crisp Sancerre sat between them. It was a perfect portrait of civilized, comfortable domesticity, and for Alistair, it was an exquisite form of torture. He felt like a spy at his own dinner table, a foreign agent who had mastered the customs but could be exposed at any moment. Eleanor was talking about the Historical Society's fundraiser, her voice a calm, pleasant murmur. And Alistair was nodding, smiling, making the appropriate responses, while his mind was miles away, reliving the feel of Clara's skin against the cold wood of his desk. "You seem so far away lately, Alistair," Eleanor said, her voice cutting through his reverie. She wasn't looking at him accusingly, just with a kind of gentle, wifely concern. "Is everything all right at the department?" The simple question felt like an interrogation. "Fine," he said, his voice a little too loud. "Just busy. The end of the semester is always a rush." He took a long sip of wine, the cool liquid doing nothing to quench the fire in his gut. And then it happened. The low, telltale buzz of his phone against the polished mahogany of the dining table. They both looked down at it. The screen was lit up, displaying a new message. It was from Clara, and he could see the first few words of the preview. "I hate this. I hate knowing you're there with her right now." Time seemed to slow down. His heart felt like it stopped, then started again with a painful, violent lurch. He felt the blood drain from his face. He quickly grabbed the phone, his hand shaking, and flipped it over, but it was too late. He knew Eleanor had seen the screen light up. He didn't know if she could have read the words, but he saw the look on her face change. The gentle concern was replaced by a flicker of something else, a quiet, sharp-eyed curiosity. "An urgent message from a student?" she asked, her voice perfectly even. "Yes," he lied, the word feeling thick and clumsy in his mouth. "A question about a deadline." "It's nothing." He shoved the phone into his pocket, his hand still trembling. The rest of the dinner was an agony. The delicious salmon tasted like cardboard. The silence between them was no longer comfortable. It was thick with unspoken questions, with the ghost of Clara's jealous, desperate words. Alistair felt profoundly, irrevocably exposed. He was certain Eleanor knew. Maybe not the details, maybe not the who or the when, but she knew the fundamental truth. He was a liar, and his heart belonged elsewhere. After dinner, he helped clear the plates, the familiar domestic ritual feeling bizarre and theatrical. He moved through his own house like a trespasser. He looked at the photographs on the mantelpiece, a smiling, younger version of himself and Eleanor on their wedding day, on holidays in Italy, at university functions. He saw two strangers, two people from another lifetime whose life he had somehow stolen. The comfortable armchair where he read in the evenings, the worn spines of the books he loved, the faint scent of Eleanor's perfume in the air. It was all the scenery of a life that was no longer his. He was a ghost in his own home, haunting the rooms where he was supposed to belong. That night, lying in the darkness of their bedroom, the chasm between him and Eleanor felt like a physical presence in the bed. He lay rigid, feigning sleep, listening to the soft rustle of pages as she read. The guilt was a physical thing, a heavy stone in his chest. It was no longer just the guilt of his betrayal, but the profound shame of his recklessness, the nauseating fear of losing everything, the comfortable, respectable life he had simultaneously grown to despise and couldn't imagine living without. The affair had started as an escape, a doorway into a more vibrant, authentic existence. But now, the door had slammed shut behind him, and he found himself in a new kind of prison. It was a prison of constant anxiety, of carefully constructed lies, of a lover whose emotional demands were escalating with each passing day. He wanted the thrill without the consequence, the passion without the possession, the escape without the obligation. He now saw with horrifying clarity that such a thing was impossible. He had wanted to feel alive, and he had succeeded. But he was discovering that being truly alive meant being vulnerable to pain, to ruin, to a fallout that was emotional, psychological, and devastatingly real. He was being torn in two, and he knew, as he lay there in the dark, that sooner or later, something had to break. The text message that summoned him was stark, stripped of all their usual playful artifice. It was not a line of poetry, not a coded academic reference. It was 4 simple, cold words. "We need to talk," followed by her address. The absence of code was its own message. The game was over. Alistair drove to her small apartment with a sense of dread that was colder and heavier than the familiar fear of being discovered. This was not about the risk of exposure. This was about the risk of reality. A force he was beginning to understand was far more dangerous. When he knocked, she opened the door immediately, as if she had been waiting just behind it. The woman who stood before him was not the seductive creature from the hotel room or the defiant transgressor from his office. This was a third Clara, one he barely knew. She was dressed in worn jeans and a gray university sweatshirt, her hair pulled back in a simple, unadorned ponytail. Her face was pale, her eyes clear and serious. There was no welcome in her expression, only a profound, weary gravity. The apartment, which had once seemed like a charming bohemian love nest, now felt small and Spartan. He saw it for what it was, the temporary, threadbare home of a struggling graduate student. A stack of overdue library books sat on the floor, and the air smelled of brewing tea, not jasmine perfume. "Sit down," she said, her voice quiet but firm. It was not a request. She didn't sit opposite him but remained standing, leaning against the small kitchen counter, creating a deliberate distance between them. She held a mug in both hands, her knuckles white. She was not a lover waiting for her paramour. She was a panelist about to begin an oral examination, and he was the terrified candidate. "I've been doing a lot of thinking, Alistair," she began, her gaze unwavering. "About us." about what this is, and I've come to the conclusion that I don't actually know, and I don't think you do either." He started to speak, to offer some placating romantic phrase, but she held up a hand to stop him. "Please, just let me finish. When this started, I told myself it was about the connection, the intellectual fire, and it was, but it's become more than that, and we both know it. We've moved beyond stolen moments and literary games. We are sharing a life, Alistair, a secret, partial, exhausting life, but a life nonetheless, and I need to know where it's going." She took a breath, her composure absolute, but he could see the slight tremor in her hands. "I am 25 years old. My entire future, my career, is something I am building right now, in this university. If this affair comes out, I won't be seen as a brilliant young woman who fell for her professor. I'll be seen as a slut, a manipulator, an opportunist. My academic credibility will be destroyed. I am risking everything, every single day." He felt a defensive retort rise in his throat. "I'm risking my marriage, my career." But he swallowed it. He knew in a moment of sickening clarity that her risk was greater. He had a life to lose. She had a life that might never be allowed to begin. "It's not just the risk," she continued, her voice softening slightly, which was somehow worse. "It's my heart. I allowed this to happen because my feelings for you are real. I respect you, I admire you, and God help me, I think I'm falling in love with you. And I can't do this anymore if I'm just a symptom, an escape, a beautiful, tragic character in the novel of your midlife crisis. I am a real person, and I need to know if this is a real relationship." She finally looked away from him, staring out the small window at the darkening street. "So I have to ask you the question you've been avoiding. What do you want? Not in a coded email, not in a stolen kiss in the library. Right here, now. What do you want from me? Is there a future for us? Are you going to leave your wife? Because if the answer is no, you need to tell me. If all this can ever be is hotel rooms and frantic encounters in your office, then you need to be honest, so I can decide if that's a life I'm willing to accept. Because right now, living like this, waiting for the moments you can spare for me, it's not enough. It's starting to break me." The silence in the room was absolute. The directness of her questions, the raw, unvarnished honesty of her speech, had dismantled all of his defenses. He felt naked, exposed, a fraud. He was the great Professor Finch, the master of language and interpretation, and he had no words. He opened his mouth, and a weak, pathetic platitude came out. "Clara, you know how I feel. You're the most alive thing in my life." She turned back from the window, and her eyes were filled not with anger, but with a deep, profound disappointment. "That's not an answer, Alistair. That's a line from a poem. I'm not asking you to write me a sonnet. I'm asking you what you are going to do." He floundered, grabbing for the easy excuses. It's complicated. My marriage. It's 2 decades of my life. My position. The scandal. I know it's complicated." She cut him off, her voice sharp for the first time. "My life is complicated too, and you are the one who complicated it. I'm not asking you if it's easy. I'm asking you what you want." And in that moment, under her relentless, intelligent gaze, Alistair was forced to confront the truth he had so skillfully avoided. He didn't know. He wanted her, yes, with a desperation that hollowed him out. He wanted the passion, the validation, the feeling of being seen and desired. But did he want the ugly public mess of a divorce? The tearful confrontations, the division of assets, the pitying looks from his colleagues, the ruin of his reputation. Did he want to trade his comfortable, predictable prison for the terrifying, chaotic freedom of a new life with her? The honest answer was no. He was a coward. He loved the poetry of their affair, the idea of a grand, forbidden passion, but he was terrified of the prose, of the messy, everyday reality of building a life from the wreckage of another. His silence was the only answer he could give, and it was the only one she needed. The power in the room had shifted entirely. He, the professor, was the one who was lost, evasive, and emotionally illiterate. She, the student, was the one with the clarity, the strength, the courage to face the truth. "I see," she said softly, the disappointment in her voice like a physical blow. "You don't know," which means the answer is no. She walked over and picked up his coat from the chair where he'd dropped it. She held it out to him. "I think you should go, Alistair." He left her apartment feeling hollowed out, diminished. The affair was no longer an intoxicating escape. It was a problem to be solved, an emotional equation for which he had no solution. He had seen Clara as a muse, a brilliant and beautiful creature who had awakened his dormant soul. He saw now that he had made a terrible mistake. He had not been dealing with a character in a book. He had been dealing with a woman, and he had broken her heart, and his own, with his selfish, cowardly inability to choose. The confrontation was over, but the real crisis had just begun. The confrontation in Clara's apartment left a rift between them, a chasm of unspoken truths and unanswered questions. For 3 days, a heavy silence stretched, punctuated only by the frantic, silent screaming inside Alistair's own head. He told himself it was for the best, a necessary cooling off, a prelude to a clean break, but he was an addict in withdrawal, and his resolve was a fragile, brittle thing. The craving for her, for the intoxicating escape she represented, began to gnaw at him, overriding the fear, overriding the shame, overriding common sense. On the 4th day, he broke. He sent a simple, pathetic message. "I need to see you." Her reply was instantaneous, as if she too had been wrestling with the same desperate craving. "Where?" The need was mutual, a destructive magnetic pull they were both powerless to resist. This time there was no pretense of academic work, no clever codes. It was a raw, undisguised summons to feed their shared addiction. They met in his car, a regression to the scene of their first transgression. He drove to the campus arboretum, a sprawling wooded area that was beautiful by day and deeply isolated by night, and parked at a secluded spot overlooking a small moonlit pond. The setting felt poetic, but the mood in the car was anything but. The easy intimacy they once shared was gone, replaced by a tense, awkward silence. The ghost of their argument hung between them, a third passenger in the car. He tried to speak, to apologize, to explain the paralysis she had so clearly exposed in him, but the words wouldn't come. She, in turn, sat staring out at the dark water, her profile a study in guarded sorrow. Words had failed them. So they turned to the only language they had left, the one language that could temporarily silence the noise in their heads. He reached for her, and she turned to him, and their kiss was not tender or passionate, but frantic and sad. It was the kiss of two people trying to erase a painful conversation, trying to find their way back to a simpler, more ignorant time. The physical act that followed was a desperate, almost violent attempt to reconnect. It was not lovemaking. It was a frantic clawing for oblivion. It was messy and hurried, fueled not by joy or even lust, but by a deep, shared unhappiness. He pushed her seat back, and in the cramped, familiar space, they fumbled with clothes, their movements urgent and graceless. It was a sad pantomime of their former passion, an act performed to reassure themselves that the connection, the fire, was still there, even as they both knew, deep down, that it had been extinguished, leaving only embers and smoke. He was lost in the motion, in the familiar feel of her body, trying to find a moment's peace in the eye of his self-made hurricane, when the world outside their fogged-up windows exploded in a blaze of white light. Headlights. A car had pulled up behind them, its high beams slicing through the darkness, pinning their vehicle in a brutal, unforgiving glare. For a frozen second, Alistair's mind went blank. Then, pure, cold, undiluted terror seized him. He could see the silhouette of the vehicle in his rearview mirror. A boxy shape, a light bar on the roof, campus security. His heart hammered against his ribs so hard he thought it would break through. He and Clara scrambled apart, a clumsy, pathetic tangle of limbs and clothing, pulling at shirts and trousers with shaking, useless fingers. A powerful flashlight beam detached from the blinding headlights and began a slow, methodical sweep of the area. It danced across the trees, the pond, and then it began to crawl, with agonizing slowness, towards his car. "Oh God," Clara whispered, her voice a thin, terrified thread of sound. "Oh my God, Alistair!" He was paralyzed, his mind racing. His car was registered with the university. They would know it was his. He imagined the security guard approaching, the knock on the window, the slow, dawning recognition on the guard's face. He saw his life ending, right there, in that beam of light. The flashlight beam hit the rear of his car and stopped. It rested there for what felt like an eternity, an unblinking eye of judgment. He could hear the faint crackle of a radio from the other vehicle. He pictured the guard speaking into it, reporting a suspicious vehicle, running his license plate. He held his breath, waiting for the inevitable tap on the glass, the quiet, authoritative voice that would signal the end of everything. He squeezed his eyes shut. And then, as suddenly as it had arrived, the light moved on. It completed its sweep of the area and was extinguished. The security vehicle, after another impossibly long pause, slowly pulled away, its taillights disappearing down the narrow lane. They were alone again, in the darkness. The silence that descended was absolute, a vacuum where desire and passion had been violently sucked out, leaving only a sickening, hollow dread. The adrenaline rush was gone, replaced by a cold sweat and a tremor Alistair couldn't control. He looked at Clara. In the dim moonlight, her face was a pale, tear-streaked mask of pure terror. The illusion was shattered, completely and irrevocably. The magic, the romance, the thrill, it was all gone, burned away by the harsh, interrogating light. All that was left was the sordid reality. A middle-aged professor and his graduate student, hiding in a car like guilty teenagers, nearly caught in a pathetic, desperate tryst. He drove her back to her apartment in a toxic, suffocating silence. There was nothing to say. The near miss had said it all. When she got out of the car, she didn't look back. Alistair went home, but the terror followed him. It was no longer a background hum. It was a tangible presence, a monster sitting in the room with him. The paranoia, which had been a creeping vine, now grew with explosive force, choking everything. He sat at his computer until 3 a.m., obsessively refreshing the campus security daily blotter online, searching for any mention of a car at the Arboretum. He saw none, but it brought him no comfort. He imagined the guards laughing about it in the break room, the story spreading. The next day at the university was a nightmare. Every student who glanced at him, every colleague who said hello, seemed to know. Their eyes were filled with pity and contempt. The pleasure of the affair was now a distant, unbelievable memory. It had been entirely consumed by the fear. The joy he had once felt in her presence was now inextricably linked with the memory of that blinding light, with the sickening lurch of his stomach, with the absolute certainty of his own ruin. That night in the Arboretum was the breaking point. The affair was no longer a dangerous game. It was an active threat, a ticking bomb he had built himself and strapped to the foundation of his life. He finally understood. This couldn't go on. It had to end. The relationship had become a weapon pointed at his own head. And that night, he had felt the cold, undeniable pressure of his own finger tightening on the trigger. The silence that followed the Arboretum incident was not the tense, anticipatory silence of before. It was the dead, hollow silence of the tomb. For a week, they did not speak, did not text, did not email. Alistair existed in a state of suspended animation, a ghost haunting the edges of his own life. The fear of discovery had done its work, cauterizing the wound of his desire, leaving behind only the scar tissue of terror and a profound, aching sadness. The affair was over. He knew it with a certainty that was both a relief and a devastation, but it could not end in a panicked flight and a toxic silence. An affair born of poetry could not end with such ugly, clumsy prose. It needed a final verse, a coda, a deliberate, heartbreaking farewell. He owed her that. He owed himself that. He found the place online, a relic from another era on a forgotten stretch of highway miles from the university. The Bluebird Inn. The name was so painfully, perfectly sad. He sent her a final, uncoded message, his thumbs heavy on the screen. "Clara, there's a place called the Bluebird Inn. I've booked a room for tonight. I need to see you. One last time." He added the last 4 words because honesty, at this late stage, felt like the only currency he had left. She simply replied, "I'll be there." The room was even more melancholic than he had imagined. The carpet was a faded maroon. The furniture was dark and scarred with the history of 1,000 other lonely nights, and the air held a faint, lingering scent of old cigarettes and disappointment. A neon sign outside the window sputtered, bathing the room in a pulsating, spectral blue light. It was not a place for beginnings or for passion. It was a place for endings. He sat on the edge of the stiff chenille bedspread and waited, feeling not the thrill of anticipation, but the solemn, heavy weight of a man waiting to attend a funeral. When her knock came, it was so soft he almost missed it. He opened the door, and his heart broke. She looked tired, her eyes shadowed, the vibrant life that had so captivated him now, muted by a deep, visible sorrow. They stood for a moment, two mourners, at the wake of their own love. There were no games left to play. "I'm sorry, Clara," he began, his voice cracking. "I'm so sorry for all of this, for my cowardice, for what I've put you through." She didn't answer right away. She just looked at him, her eyes welling with tears she refused to let fall. "I know," she whispered. "I am too." He stepped forward and wrapped his arms around her, holding her tightly. It was not the embrace of a lover, but of a comrade in a shared, devastating loss. They stood like that for a long time, simply holding each other, two people clinging together in the wreckage they had created. The air was thick with all the things they could not say, the apologies, the recriminations, the impossible, futile wishes for a different world, a different timeline. And because words were inadequate, because they had only ever truly spoken the truth with their bodies, they turned to that language for their final farewell. It began with a kiss of breathtaking sadness, a slow, gentle pressing of lips, a taste of salt from her unshed tears. He led her to the bed, and they undressed each other with a slow, tender reverence. This was not a prelude to passion, but a sacred, final ritual. He was not undressing a lover to possess her. He was unwrapping a precious, fragile gift he knew he could not keep. Every touch was a word, every caress a sentence in their final, silent conversation. He touched her as if trying to memorize her, to create a perfect, three-dimensional map of her that he could navigate in his mind during the long, empty years to come. His fingers traced the delicate curve of her collarbone, a line of silent apology. He kissed the soft, vulnerable skin of her inner wrist, a plea for forgiveness. He buried his face in her hair, inhaling her scent one last time, trying to bottle it in his memory. She, in turn, held his face in her hands, her thumbs stroking his cheeks, her eyes communicating a universe of sorrow and forgiveness. Her hands roamed his back, not with the desperate grip of passion, but with the clinging hold of someone saying goodbye forever. When they finally came together, the act itself was a slow, mournful ballet. He moved with an agonizing slowness, trying to draw out every second, to make this last time last a lifetime. It was not about pleasure, not about the frantic search for climax. It was about connection, a final, desperate attempt to merge, to become one before they were torn apart for good. He watched her face in the ghostly blue light, her eyes closed, a single tear tracing a silver path down her temple. The sadness was so profound, it was almost beautiful, a perfect, tragic poem. But beneath the grief, the embers of their passion stirred for one last, defiant blaze. The slowness gave way to a desperate, almost angry intensity. It was the passion of the dying, a rage against the inevitable. Their bodies moved with a fierce, grieving energy, a final, frantic dance on the edge of the abyss. The sounds in the room were not the unrestrained moans of ecstasy, but the choked, half-sobbed cries of two people losing everything. It was the ugliest, most beautiful, most honest love they had ever made. The climax was a shared, shuddering release, a wave of sensation that was inextricably fused with a wave of pure, undiluted grief. It was the moment the final cord was severed. As the last tremor subsided, they collapsed against each other, their bodies slick with sweat and tears, and the full weight of their finality crashed down upon them. They held each other in the aftermath, no longer lovers, but two survivors of a beautiful disaster. The pulsating blue light from the motel sign was a relentless, rhythmic heartbeat counting down their last moments together. Eventually, they untangled themselves and began to dress in a heavy, funereal silence. The small, mundane acts pulling on a shirt, buckling a belt, felt impossibly sad, a final, brutal confirmation that they were returning to their separate worlds. At the door, there were no more tears, no dramatic farewells. All the goodbyes had been said. "Take care of yourself, Alistair," she whispered, her voice hollow. "You too, Clara," he replied, his own voice a stranger's. He watched from the doorway as she walked across the damp asphalt to her car. He watched as the red taillights ignited, as she pulled out onto the empty highway, as she became a smaller and smaller point of light, until she disappeared completely into the vast, indifferent darkness. He was alone in the sad blue room, the air still holding the ghost of her scent, the sheets on the bed still holding the faint, cooling warmth of their bodies. The question mark from his invitation, "One last time," had been a lie. He knew it now. This was not a question. It was a period. A full stop. The end of the only chapter of his life where he had ever truly felt alive. And as he stood there, he knew with a chilling certainty that he had just condemned himself to a life sentence of haunting. The end did not come with a bang, but with a slow, agonizing fade to gray. In the weeks that followed their goodbye at the Bluebird Inn, Alistair saw Clara twice on campus. They were like ghosts to each other, their paths crossing in the library or on the quad, their eyes meeting for a brief, searing moment of shared history before skittering away. There was no anger in her gaze, only a vast, bottomless sadness that mirrored his own. They were two magnets forced into repulsion, forever aware of the powerful, invisible field that still existed between them. Then came the end of the semester, and with it, the departmental graduation ceremony. He sat on the stage with the other faculty, a row of robed academics, and watched as she walked across it to receive her master's degree. She looked poised, beautiful, a future stretching before her. As she took her diploma, her eyes scanned the faculty, and for a single, final beat, they found his. It was a look of quiet, final acknowledgement, a thank you, a goodbye. And then she was gone, disappearing into the crowd of celebrating families, swallowed up by the life that was waiting for her, a life he had chosen not to be a part of. And so the seasons turned, 1 year, then 2, then 5. On the surface, Alistair Finch's life resumed its predictable, respectable course. He published another well-regarded book on the Romantics. He became the head of his department. His marriage to Eleanor settled back into its comfortable, frictionless rhythm, a partnership of quiet companionship and shared social obligations. From the outside, he was a success, a man at the pinnacle of his career, his life a testament to stability and intellectual achievement. He had, by all external measures, gotten away with it. There had been no scandal, no divorce, no ruin. He had stood on the edge of the abyss, looked into its chaotic, passionate depths, and had wisely, sensibly, stepped back onto solid ground. But the abyss had looked back at him, and it had left its mark. He was a haunted man. The haunting was not a dramatic, spectral thing, but a quiet, constant presence, a ghost that lived in the mundane moments of his life. It was in the face of a new graduate student, bright-eyed and ambitious, whose hair fell across her face in a way that made his heart stop for a second. It was in a line of Keats, read aloud to a class of bored undergraduates, a line about beauty and truth that would suddenly catch in his throat, his mind filled not with literary analysis, but with the memory of her skin in the ghostly blue light of a motel room. It was in the sudden, unexpected scent of jasmine from a stranger's perfume as he walked down the street, a scent that could, for a fleeting moment, erase 5 years and transport him back to the passenger seat of his car on a rainy night. He had become an expert on the subject of his own regret, a scholar of a text only he could read. The passion he had known with Clara had become the gold standard against which all other feelings were measured, and everything else in his life felt like a pale, worthless imitation. The silence in his home with Eleanor was the most potent ghost of all. It was no longer the comfortable, empty silence of their pre-Clara life. It was a heavy, weighted thing, thick with unspoken possibilities. He would look at his wife across the dinner table and wonder if she knew. Had she seen the name on the phone that night? Had she pieced together the fragments of his distraction, his lies, his sadness? He never found out. She never asked. Perhaps she had made her own sensible choice, a decision to preserve the life they had built together, to not pull at a thread that might unravel everything. Or perhaps she truly knew nothing. The not knowing was its own kind of torture. He looked at her, this woman he had shared a life with, and felt a new, more profound guilt. He had not only betrayed her with his body, he had betrayed her with his cowardice, by choosing to remain in this safe, silent prison with her, rather than face the terrifying truth of his own heart. One night, years after she had gone, he found himself working late in his office, the scene of their most reckless encounter. The room was the same, the books, the desk, the framed degrees on the wall, but it was a sterile, hollow space now, a mausoleum. He had won. He had kept it all. He stood and walked to the window, looking down at the empty, lamplit campus. The night was quiet, still. He thought of Clara, wondering where she was, what kind of life she had built. He hoped she was happy. He hoped she had found a love that was not a secret, not a sin, not a source of pain. He had chosen safety over passion, order over chaos, quiet regret over loud ruin. It was the choice any sane, rational man would have made. But as he stood there, alone in the heart of his respectable life, surrounded by all the evidence of his success, a single, devastating question echoed in the silent chambers of his soul. He had saved his life, yes, but in the process, had he forgotten how to live it? The ghost of her memory gave no answer. It simply remained, a beautiful, permanent ache, the quiet, lifelong price of his weakness.